Okay, well, hey, welcome to the panel on transformative games. And based on the kind of brief description that Charles did prior to this session, at the end of last session, my guess is that half of you are here to even just learn what transformative games are, which is great. And we'll actually start off with that and kind of debate a little bit on that definition. And we'll also do introductions as part of that. So my name is Andy Petrosky, and I am a Senior Director of Curriculum Services at Elsevier, but just 3 months ago, I was actually staff and faculty member at Harrisburg University and have worked with Charles and the team here at HU over the past 7 years in developing, designing a lot of the game, and especially the serious game curriculum that we have in our undergraduate and graduate programs, and actually have done some game design and development with Charles for alternate reality games, for conferences and other training purposes. And Charles and I actually have a book coming out later this fall, early next year, on alternate reality games for performance improvement. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's shine the spotlight where it belongs on our panelists, and let's just go down the row here from closest to me down. So Chris, if you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you define transformative games, and especially how they're different, or maybe even the differences and similarities to games that are strictly for entertainment purposes.
Sure. Just briefly, my name is Chris Arnold, and I'm here from Schell Games. Just to tell you a little bit about my studio, we are a transformational games studio. We specialize in innovative and pioneering education games and experiences. We're located in Pittsburgh. But enough about that and more about transformational games. So, so this is a tough word, and because you hear a lot of different things. You hear serious games. We actually have some words on there to say serious games. You have educational games. So why are we calling it transformational games? I think that has a lot to do with the focus. So as a game designer, you're generally concerned with someone's activities while they're in your experience. You have the entire outside world going on, and you have this little bubble that you've created, that you're in your imagination, and they're going through it, and they're jumping over things. If it's a platformer, they're strategizing about ways of attacking someone. And that's your primary concern. Everything and all your energy is going to that level and that experience right there. Transformational games are a little bit different in that you're concerned, of course, with their experience in the game, but primarily you want that experience to transform their behavior in the real world. You want whatever you put in that little sphere to affect and transfer skills, perspective, mindset, into the real world, and you want to also do that in a permanent way. So when we think about transformational games, we think of it as a means of transferring behaviors learned in-game, and then also a means of making those persistent changes. So that's really tough to do, and that different perspective is, I think, how I define and how our studio has defined the difference between a purely educational type game design and something that we refer to as transformational.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So Emily will be next. Before we do that, though, I want to remind everyone or note again that we have the Let's Play PA hashtag up there for those of you on Twitter. Definitely check that out, and certainly we're going to take some time during the panel discussion to take some audience questions. But if you have questions that aren't a part of the panel for time or one reason or another, certainly tweet those out on that hashtag. I'll be out there later, and I'm sure some of our panelists will as well, and we can answer questions there also. So Emily, you're next. Same question to you.
Sure. So I'm Emily. I am the VP of Production Services at Games for Change, and we work at the hub of social impact games, working with people from all different sectors trying to create social impact out of gaming media. We run a bunch of different initiatives, but my focus is on the game development side. And let's see, how do I define transformational
Yeah,
media?
how do you define it or differentiate it from entertainment games?
Yeah, so I think I usually describe it to people in a kind of an analogy of other types of media. So if you think about film versus documentary film, documentary films are really trying to convey a message. They're trying to move people. They're trying to have people have a different type of opinion when they come out of the film. If you think about the difference between art and design, art is art for art's sake, to enjoy it, to be beautiful. Design is form follows function. So you very much are trying to solve a problem or create a solution out of it. So I think of transformational games as something that you're using as a solution. You're using the gaming media to create a solution to a problem.
Great. Excellent analogy. Chris?
So my name is Chris Bennett. I'm co-founder and director of Skyless Game Studios in Philadelphia, and we basically develop games for social, educational, and philanthropic impact. And I guess how I would define it, it's a little bit of a tough question, because I think in some ways almost any game can be a transformational game. But I think really, when it comes down to we're talking about the industry of creating transformational games, it's all about intent. Almost any game design can potentially convey a message and change behavior, and that's really what your goal is with a transformational game. And I think that a lot of people get a little bit too hung up on viewing them as being something completely separate or even just their own sort of special category. And then they think that transformational games, or as they're probably more commonly called outside of our space, educational games, although that can be slightly different as well, as being boring and as being really sort of kind of stiff and lecture-y. But that's not really how it has to be. I think any game that really has a message that's going to make the player outside of the game do something or think something differently than they would have beforehand is a transformational game. And of course, when that is the goal of it, that's basically when we're talking about it as the industry of transformational games.
Great, thank you. So, okay, let's dive into it now. Let's come back to Emily in the middle here. What's the best transformative game that you've seen or played yourself? And why was it the best?
Yeah, so I think there's a really great game out there called Fold It. I don't know if you guys are familiar. I think that's a really great example of how people have come together. This game was basically a group of scientists were trying to figure out how to solve DNA protein structure things. I don't know how to describe it in a scientific way because I'm not a scientist. But the idea was that they couldn't figure this out for 10 years, and they created a game. It was basically a puzzle game that people could come and play. And through that game, people were actually able to solve this puzzle. And this was like a huge scientific breakthrough on DNA proteins. And I think that just shows the power of how something turned into a gamified experience brings people together and can help solve kind of very huge problems that we have, or huge scientific inquiries.
Yeah, Fold It is a great example. Crowdsourcing was a big component of that, and there were some drugs that were developed as a result of some of the DNA protein combinations that some of the players came up with.
They've created like new versions of it now. So essentially, this idea of crowdsourcing and gamifying this experience has brought science a lot further ahead than what had happened in the previous 10 years. So I think that's a really great and strong example. We have lots of examples, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of research around a lot of it, and that validation and confirmation that it's effective can be really problematic. I have a lot of anecdotes of things that I've played that I'm like, wow, this is really cool. There's a game out there that helps people overcome their fear of spiders. So I personally, that was one for me that, it's kind of like, it's like it's coming at you. But for me, I was afraid of spiders, so that was really effective. And even without any, evaluation, formal research done on it, it helped me, so.
I was just going to ask, are you no longer afraid of spiders?
I'm
We're all afraid of some spiders.
The big ones still, I think. The ones that people put on their houses during Halloween, not cool, but little ones I can handle now.
Okay. Chris, Arnold, same question to you. Best transformative game you've seen or played yourself?
Okay, so best is an interesting word. So I'm going to take it from kind of where you talked about efficacy. That's a big topic. So one of the things that is I think, a barrier towards widespread adoption of games as a real mechanism for change or a catalyst for change in people, and we're talking about people investing them in large ways, is the question of efficacy. So the most exciting game that I've played is self-servingly one that we made called Play Forward, and it was a game that Yale University now through their Play to Prevent program and Schell Games developed to address a very serious problem. And that serious problem was the higher than expected incident of HIV infection within a particular demographic. So we worked with them hand in hand to develop games to help teach in a more effective and engaging way the connection between risky behavior and this kind of effect. Now, so that was exciting, but the most exciting thing isn't necessarily the game itself. We think it was a great game. They think it was a great game, but who cares if it doesn't work? So the thing that was really exciting was that they had the ability to and the desire to test it over a longitudinal study. So that longitudinal study is now 3 years old, and the effects are significant. And you know they published an initial paper, and they will be publishing a final paper soon to come. But so I think best is, as a game designer, you know, is an industry we think of, is it the most exciting? Best might be a little bit different in the transformational game space. Best might be most effective, and these sorts of studies might might prove that out. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And you know, not being familiar with that game, I'm sure it's very well designed, but it's probably not something that, you know, would you'd put up beside a AAA title or something like that, you know?
Well, no, design is very much in collaboration with subject matter experts.
Right.
And to do so in an engaging way. This is where you try to flex your design, your design ability to make sure that you still have all of the engaging excitement of game mechanics that are tried and true and proven to generate this sort of thing, but also be solving these big problems in conjunction with your subject matter experts.
Okay, great, thanks. So efficacy is definitely, you know, proving that efficacy and you know, a volume of those types of studies and outcomes that have been, you know, proven, especially over a longer period of time, certainly is one of the challenges in, you know, wider scale adoption of transformative games. But Chris Bennett, what are some other challenges, you know, that you feel or you've seen around wide scale adoption of transformative games, you know, in organizations or just as, you know, generally games that people will flock to?
Sure. So definitely, well, I mean, that's obviously a constant conversation in our industry is proving impact. But I think probably the biggest sort of issue that I see is people's understanding of games and what they are. And for a lot of people, and particularly the older audience, that they actually like games and that they play games without even necessarily realizing it. I can't tell you how many times I have educators talk to me and say, I'm interested in making a game. I've never played games myself, so you know, I don't know what I'm doing, but like I want to kind of make this happen. But everybody plays games and has played games throughout their life. It's a big part of the human experience. You know, even if it doesn't have to be a video game, you know, it can be a sort of imaginative game in the playground. It can be a board game with your family. And a lot of people just sort of view it as this like weird new media that only kids play, and only, a lot of people think only male, like young boys play. And that's just not really true at all. In fact, I think the distribution is basically 50-50 between genders. Like the median age of gamers is like in 30s or something, if I remember correctly. It's like completely opposite of what most people think. And so I think that just people understanding that this is already a part of their life, this is already something that people all over sort of the entire spectrum of ages, you know, both genders, or all genders, I should say, really, are engaging in, and it's just a part of our experience. And I think once we start getting to the point where people realize that, and where games just become almost more like subtly involved in our lives, and they're not something that people think is new and weird and sort of nerdy or whatever. That's going to be a really major changing point in the future. But yeah, basically, probably the biggest problem I see is that people, they just think of like Call of Duty or what have you when they think of games. But of course, we all know, as hopefully everybody here knows, it is a lot more than that.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I think our what people have been predisposed to and what their sense of a game is, both like you were saying, either them excluding themselves from that environment or thinking that it's something completely different than what a transformative game may be is certainly a challenge. Emily, I know Games for Change deals with a lot of serious topics. So, how have you guys managed addressing those topics through gameplay?
I think we do. People reach out to us from all different sectors. I think just to get back to the barriers question, because we see a lot of people who are coming into the space for the first time. So we see a lot of patterns with how people fail fast. Or are setting themselves up to fail. Part of it is a lot of time people are coming from outside any technical experience and they have no idea how to develop a game. But they get excited about developing games. They think that they're better designers than professional game designers. And we'll often say to them, yeah, that game already exists. Your great idea already has been built and isn't really that successful, so you need to go back to the drawing board. And that can be a really disappointing conversation, right? Because they think they have this great idea, they maybe haven't done their research, they haven't done the background. Another is lack of budget. We have a lot of people who come and say, I want to make a great game experience, something like Call of Duty. I have about $3,000, can I do it? And we kind of say to them, we'll work with you to help find funding, right? Because that's really the barrier is you don't have enough funding to actually develop the game or do the evaluation behind the game to validate that it's effective. I think the other thing that kind of narrows the scope is we have a lot of people who come from very niche sectors. So they're building a game that's very specific to their needs, to their audiences, to their demographic, their location and region, but it's not necessarily having a global appeal. So widespread adoption just isn't, it's not even considered, or it's not really, there's not a model for it. And the other thing is that in our space, there isn't a publishing model. In the commercial entertainment game space, you have big publishers with big budgets who can market your games and promote them and publish them and get them out there. That just doesn't exist in this space. And that's something where Games for Change is trying to help and create pathways for that. But that's a huge barrier for individuals, especially when they've created a great game, they want to get it to audiences. There really isn't a channel to do that.
And not to hijack here, but I think that was very important, talking about there being a clog in the distribution channel from people that are making things to get it out. But there's also something very important from someone I think a lot of this from like a teacher's perspective, because my mom was a public school teacher for 40 years, so just yay public schools. Wanting to incorporate games in your classroom. There's plenty of people that are excited about games. They love games. If you talk to any teacher about a game, gosh, I really wish I could do this. What are the barriers of getting that in? Well, there's a couple things in just talking with people that I hear. First is kind of thinking about how they're evaluated. If you're a teacher, you have a very defined set of things that you need to accomplish in a given year. And you look for games and you go on, where do you go? That's the question. Where do I go to get these games? Well, you can go to the App Store. And the App Store is great in that it allows people to publish their stuff very easily, but it's terrible because it allows people to publish their stuff very easily. And so it's difficult to be able to separate wheat from chaff. To be able to for a teacher that, hey, I really want this lesson to hit these core standards that I need to teach. Gosh, I have no certainty as to the quality of the game, if it's actually going to teach it. And so that slows it from an individual teacher perspective. From a school perspective, just magnify that problem. So we have a lot of different companies that are trying to start solving that problem of distribution channel. One of our partners, goes out very aggressively to school districts, Amplify Education, and to try to sell them on a total curriculum model. We've also worked with a company or a nonprofit called Glass Lab that tries to solve that by allowing a curated group of games that have been proven effective for certain types of lessons and to be a reliable channel. But if we're talking about things that are stunting widespread adoption, distribution channel, and of course, I think is very paramount, because once there is a proven distribution channel that you can see these games making money, investment will follow. So there's an unreliable distribution channel, there's unreliable investment, Spartan adoption.
Two other things to add to that. Sorry, not to keep taking over, but two other things that
Sorry,
we see
Andy.
specifically in the education space and with teachers is teachers are used to having a teacher's manual.
Oh, yeah.
When they get a textbook, they can flip through the chapters and see what's in there. If you hand them a game, they have to play through the entire thing to know what's in there. And so a lot of teachers, surprise, don't have lots of free time to do that. So that's one thing. And then also the school, the actual infrastructures of the schools don't support Wi-Fi in most cases. Or they have limited Wi-Fi, or once they get all the students on, then the Wi-Fi breaks down. So that's a huge barrier where you've got, oh, you have to download this from a website. Well, all of a sudden then it's not usable. So those two are huge barriers that the White House is putting out initiatives to get improvements in the Wi-Fi infrastructure and all this stuff, but it's going to take time to get into all the schools. You've got these brick and mortar schools that were built 50, 100 years ago who, they probably don't even have pipes that work, never mind electrical outlets that are going to support this type of Wi-Fi support. So that's another one too that's just
and this sounds really doom and gloom, doesn't it? It sounds awful.
There is hope.
But no, so yes, exactly, there is hope. So we're talking about problems that exist now. There are really smart, good, dedicated, excited people working to alleviate these. And so, we think this is a very hopeful segment. We think that this will happen. I'm speaking for everyone. But we think that this will happen. And then to get to Chris's point about people, like who are these people that we need to change?
Right.
These people are, really, as the population ages and becomes more familiar with games as they are in our lives. Now with mobile devices, we play games all the time. It's not just something that you did on a console or on a computer screen. They're a part of our lives. And as and as individuals become more familiar with games and understand the power of them and engagement of them, I think that they will look more favorably towards that distribution model.
Yeah, all of these challenges that you're talking about are things that really have evolved and moved forward even over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So I think there's been big leaps. I mean, you've got companies like Filament Games that have really created kind of their own model and created affordable ways of accessing and integrating those games, because there's the access to them, the distribution channel, but then Emily, as you said, okay, how do I integrate this into my curriculum? What standards is it addressing?
Right.
All
Pro
of those.
tip, if you're going to make a game for educators, make a teacher's manual. It's easy. It's just like a one-pager. No big deal.
Yeah?
Great,
Have it on the
great.
About page.
Yeah.
And is branding still a challenge from the standpoint that the word, and you hit on this just a little bit in kind of your conclusion there, the word game is something that immediately turns people off in education and in business as well? Or do you see that changing also?
I know that a lot of the big educational publishers, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, these groups, that if they go into school institutions and they're trying to sell a product, they will not use the word game. They'll talk about interactive experiences, digital experiences, they'll dance around it in every way, but they won't use the word game because they know it won't be taken as seriously as interactive media and things like that.
Yeah.
But that's at the very educational, academic
Well,
side.
and two, game is a bit limiting. I mean, whenever we talk about it internally, we talk about experiences. Game kind of connotes that there's either a competition or an end part, and that sometimes is very useful in driving interaction and engagement and super fun, but sometimes a particular lesson might not require that. And so we tend to use experience, but yeah, a game's fine with me.
I think somewhat conversely, less so on the sort of administrative side of education, but more on the actual teachers in the classroom. sometimes game can actually be a more effective sort of branding for it than, sort of experience or solution, because their immediate thought is, I'm teaching kids, so game kind of fits in, which is kind of like, the same problem that everything is kind of two-sided, right? The problem that I talked about, that people don't understand that games can be for anyone, but they do have that immediate association. I'm teaching a middle school class, and they don't seem that interested in, math or history or whatever. A game is the perfect way to kind of engage them. But the bigger problem that we see, because we do some games for the sort of professional world as well, so not like K through 12 or a college or anything, they really don't like the term game very much. They always want to be sort of like training solutions and experiences and that sort of thing, because as soon as you say game, and you're talking to like sort of gray hair executive, they are like, nope, don't want to hear about that. But yet that's actually what they're looking for, something interactive and something digital.
Yeah, you can't have fun and learn and perform better at the same time, that's for sure.
Not possible at all.
Yeah, no, that's completely counterintuitive, yeah. Obviously, no. That's not what we're talking about. We're saying that is the case. That fun is part of learning. Back to you, Chris Bennett. What are some mistakes, and Emily touched on a few of these, but some of the mistakes that are made most often by people that are beginning to work in transformative games, and maybe even focusing a little bit more on the design side, actually creating that experience? What are some of the mistakes?
I think it depends a lot on their background. You get a kind of a variety of different people, from educators to kind of, I guess, like content producers to game designers who haven't made transformative games before. And they all try and get in different ways, and they all have their own problems. Probably the most common issue I see is a lack of understanding about choice in games. And this is purely from a game design perspective. A lot of people want to impose a narrative or impose a lesson, and they try really hard to push that in where the player is the audience. They're not the participant. And that's a big issue in games, as hopefully we all know. The player really does need to interact. They need to be a part of that, and they need to essentially learn themselves through the game. But I see a lot of basically meaningless choices put into games. I had, I won't give any details on this, but I had somebody actually talking to me just yesterday where they wanted to basically have a choice for the players in this educational game where they could pick A, B, or C, and why is the answer A, basically was what they had. There was no relevance to them picking B or C. It would immediately just funnel them back to A no matter what they chose. And it wasn't like a quiz question. It was, basically a player decision. And that's a big problem, because that's basically, coming to, instead of really being an interactive experience, becoming, watching a video and clicking next. So that's a really big issue that I see. And the other issue that I see kind of jumps back again to people not really understanding that a transformative game doesn't have to be this like really educational sort of like quasi game. It can be a real game. It can be really fun. It can be something that you would potentially play in your living room or on your phone, just for the sake of it, just because it's a fun game. And a lot of people don't get that. Sometimes that's not necessarily totally doable in the transformative game space. Obviously your learning objectives are paramount. But a lot of people just think it needs to be like a quiz with fun characters next to it or something like that. And that's not really fun. That's a quiz with art. So people not really understanding that like it can be so much more. And just, it's not going to be always the most direct translation from the standard curriculum. But you can still get all of those key learning objectives and in K through 12, all those common core, learning points within a game, and potentially in a way that kids don't even really realize consciously that they're learning it. They're just having fun.
Chris, same question to you.
Yeah, so One of the things that we found, because our studio historically did entertainment games. We weren't founded to do transformational games. We started doing it and found the power of this transition, and we really started liking it. But as we really started to get into this space, one of the things that we found that's really different in the design life cycle of the game is pre-production. So anyone here familiar with pre-production? Anyone? Okay, good. So that's whenever you're getting ideas together for your game. That's exciting. Five people, good. And you're trying to figure out what's going to work for the in-game experience that I kind of talked about before. But pre-production in a transformational game is a little bit different because you need to reach outside of your game. You need to think about the goals of your client or the goals of your game. What are those educational goals? And let's learn not just about the end goal, but the different steps you need to take a person through to be able to make that transfer happen. And all of this takes time and investment. So the pre-production becomes not only about your internal game, but how to use what's available outside of that to make it the most effective, to make that transformation the most effective and persistent as possible. So that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean just internally trying to learn on yourself. There's a lot of literature out there. This thing called the internet is awesome, a lot of information. But also probably more usefully is bringing into the fold subject matter experts that are in academic institutions. You know, if you're working on a client, their perspective and what they're bringing. And that involvement is really something that we have found critical, before the game design part. So the pre-production stage becomes a little bit bigger and maybe a little different than a traditional entertainment game.
Do you find as part of that as well that audience analysis is much more critical in a transformational game than maybe an entertainment game, especially if you're building it for a particular audience?
You really have to know. You have to know your goal, and as a part of your goal, your transformational goals, who you're aiming it towards. I mean, we've had transformational games meet for everyone. If that's the answer, then that leads you down a set of different steps in analysis. Right. Versus, hey, look, this is targeted to this demographic. We need this goal to be achieved for this group. Then you make very different choices.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Great. So let's pause with the panel questions and see if there are any questions from the audience. He doesn't even know who that is.
So my question goes back to a bit what we were talking about at the beginning of the warning that a lot of the results seen for transformative games have been anecdotal, not scientific. Can you speak to, are there any relationships that can be fostered between game makers and universities? Like what do you see being done to take steps to get more like actual scientific validity to these games, and who can help do that, and do they know they can help do that, and what sort of relationships can form and stuff?
Games for Change, I think, is a pretty big answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if everyone heard the question, but the question was really kind of how can you align evaluators or researchers doing the research around games and the game developers. And I think that's a big step that we see a lot of people missing just from the outset, not even realizing that they should be thinking about research and should be aligning with researchers. There are a lot of universities and institutions out there that are doing research specifically in games and specifically around efficacy and doing an evaluation on games to determine whether or not they're effective. I think that another kind of factor that makes it difficult is that in games, there's so many indicators, and if you guys come from a research background, indicators are basically things that you're measuring, either to show that your game is effective in one thing, or the things that you're ignoring because they're not part of your measurements. And because there's so many things going on in games that can be distractors, identifying those indicators and figuring out how to measure them within a game experience can be difficult. They have eye tracking now, they have all sorts of different biometrics that they can test with people. They can do pre and post testing. There's lots of different mechanisms for it. But I think a lot of game developers don't necessarily come from a research background, thinking about how will this game get evaluated? How will the decisions I'm making now in my design be incorporated into something that gets tested later? And I think if that happens earlier and sooner in the process, even during the pre-production phase, identifying when people play my game, they will blank, fill in the blank, what's that blank? And knowing what that is and then being able to go, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't necessarily have to have a academic institution doing your validation. If you're just trying to prove that people have achieved some awareness out of playing your game, you can do some testing on your own. But if you want to do, if you want to prove that cancer patients have effectively, taken their medications and done X, Y, Z and improved their health, you need to align with an institution that is, aligned with cancer research and all that kind of stuff. So it is about building those partnerships early, and then using those partners, using your evaluators as part of that pre-production process so you can define and understand what they're going to be measuring, how they're going to be looking at it, so you can make design decisions around that.
And what I was particularly alluding to was you guys just published a report a couple months ago on exactly how to kind of go about doing that, because it is a very open question to what even you should be measuring. It of course varies depending on the game, but it's been a struggle so far until it's getting a lot better recently. But even what that question you're trying to answer really is. But yeah, hopefully with researchers and everybody kind of playing nice together, we can get towards a point where there's much more scientific evidence.
And part of the challenge is it really is a young industry still, and there's not necessarily a really powerful, nationwide or global association that's kind of driving some of that research. There are just, more. I read over the last month. It seems like every week there's a new serious game, degree or focus at different universities, different institutes that people are putting together. So I think those opportunities to connect to those folks, and then those institutions and those faculty and students connecting back to the industry is just going to continue to evolve and grow. Yeah. I think we have another question up here. We do actually, so because we're recording it and streaming it, so you're live.
My question is related to if you were speaking to a student who is getting into this field or interested in getting into this field, where would you channel them? Because there seems to be like a psychological component of finding the right, like you were saying, with user research, and then also there's the development.
So are you speaking about getting into the industry of making these games?
Correct.
Great. So first off, I'd be really happy about that, because that's an inquisitive mind for a student to get into this. And the nice thing about the games industry in general is there's a place for everyone and everyone's skill set, because it's the most collaborative industry I've ever been a part of. And so this is going to be kind of a cop-out question. Depending on the age and the skill set, I would have them pursue whatever they interest with reckless abandon and curiosity, and to the extent that they want to make games, encourage them to make games. I know that sounds ridiculous, because what does that mean? We live in a really exciting time for people that are interested in computer science or really interested in anything, because tools are available to them. Game Maker, basic, tools that are out there to allow people. Even Unity has a very open policy of getting people in there, being able to mess around and play with things. And the other thing, so you can do that on your own, but the other thing that I've always found that's great and really separates people that stay in the industry and enjoy it very much is doing it with other people. Again, this is a collaborative industry. There are very few people that can do everything themselves. So you're looking to not only develop the hard skills, like for accomplishing tasks, but just that collaboration with others and finding like-minded people that are interested in the same things you are is, personally powerful and professionally engaging. So that's what I would say.
Any others?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I would advise against doing what I did, which was basically to jump headfirst into the whole area. I think it's very valuable to work for somebody else first in this space, and I'd say that about game design as a whole, or game development as a whole, depending on what role you kind of want to play. But it is a complicated area to get into because there is so much collaboration. There's so many parties involved kind of working together. So, and this is of course for, people who presumably are a little bit more a little older. It all depends exactly on what stage they're at, what advice I'd give. But in general, somebody who has some game background, has, an education and is basically just wanting to get started in this space. There are more and more companies, popping up in this area. Go and kind of work with them and find your way through there because it's difficult. There's a lot of moving parts that you have to manage. So understanding first what those moving parts are is extremely important.
Yeah, I think there's so many different aspects to creating games and creating serious games. I mean, you kind of have to pick where you want to play in that space. So, if you want to be a graphic designer, then you follow that maybe even more traditional path. But as someone who may want to produce serious games or someone like that, I have a little bit of a biased perspective on this, but I would really recommend kind of some sort of path into instructional technology. The challenge is that a lot of those programs lead to the type of multiple choice questions with lots of nice characters around them and not really focused on game design. So I think you probably have to augment that with some, experimenting, talking with people in the field, and really looking at games as an offshoot of maybe some more foundational instructional technology techniques. But I think it's good to have a foundation if you're working with schools and you're working with organizations, especially for behavior change using technology solutions to have that background. There is no undergraduate path to instructional technology, though. So those could be then, the undergraduate path could be more focused on a specific discipline that you're preferring, human behavior, psychology, art, really anything that's kind of focused on a design perspective, I think would be helpful. I have one more question that we'll take. Why don't we go over here?
Question is kind of for clarification. So a lot has been spoken about when it comes to transformative games, educational or instructional. So my question is, what are other examples of transformative games, or is that the definition of transformative games, instructional and educational? What would be other outside of that would be considered transformative?
So Games for Change, we work on a lot of projects that are intended for social impact, so behavior change. It might not be specifically instructional, but you're trying to build awareness in people and actually have them take an action after the game. Go and vote for this person, go and sign this petition, go to the hospital and get this medication. So those, they're behavior change. The idea is you're trying to get people to think differently about how they act in the world. So it's a little different than teaching people how to solve quadratic equations or what the endocrine system does. It's not specifically instructional. You're not getting directly instructed to do something and to learn something. There's also kind of what we refer to as like social impact games, where you're trying to get groups of people to kind of come to a cause, right? Come to this thing, participate, think about this as a community. So it's a little different than just kind of direct instruction.
And transformation is also quite broad. It can be, like you said, for social, I think you mentioned like educational, knowledge-based. It can even be it can be as direct as a physical transformation. For instance, we're working right now on an application that uses stretch reduction research done by the University of Pittsburgh to basically go through an interaction. The idea is to lower your heart rate and to go through the steps of stress management in order to make that change, so that whenever you go out in the field and you encounter some sort of you're able to recognize what's a stress inducer and go through these steps immediately to reduce your levels of stress. So again, the idea is whatever it is, whatever kind of bucket or category you have, is to do an activity that makes you act differently in a directed manner whenever you're not doing that game.
Yeah, I think that that's very true, but the one thing I'd kind of like to add to that, just to sort of somewhat broaden this answer, as if it's not broad enough already, is I think thought is also a really important thing that can be transformed by a game. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific behavior. So a great example that was actually highlighted at Games for Change this year is This War of Mine, which I would argue is primarily developed as an entertainment game, but it has a really sort of deep message and feel to it, basically about humanity and about war. And that is a transformative game as well. It leaves you, because there is that outside impact. So you play it, and it's a fun experience, although a very sort of serious fun experience. But that didn't really make sense. That's all right though. But then you go out of it, and hopefully, whether completely consciously or even just sort of subconsciously, you're thinking about what that experience was like. What it was like being a civilian in a war zone. Because that's a real issue that a huge portion of the, an alarming portion of the world's population has to deal with. We obviously have plenty of problems with that this year with Syria and everything. And sort of building that empathy for other people is a really important goal. So I guess that's kind of like social impact, but not necessarily even on such a broad sort of societal scale. It can even just be an individual kind of playing a game and just thinking a little bit differently about a real world problem. Yes,
Skills, attitude, and emotional intelligence are all areas that you guys have kind of hit on. That would we primarily you referenced skills was really the main focus, but definitely attitude and that emotional intelligence is a big area as well. And some of the best transformative games have been in those areas of attitude and self-awareness and decision making in societal situations. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I have 2 questions I want to ask the panel to start looking into their crystal ball a little bit. And if we have some time, maybe we'll take another question or 2 related to their answers to these questions. Also, if you have a question that you weren't able to ask, definitely use the Twitter hashtag to post that out there. And one of us I'll definitely be on there checking it out, and one of us will answer that question or point you in a direction for that. So let's start with you again, Chris Arnold. What's your prediction for maybe the ultimate societal organizational impact transformative games will have? What's this space gonna look like in 5 years? What's going to be the story that's being told about transformative games and the impact they can have?
Okay, so let me look here. So in 5 years, what's going to be the big story? Well, I hope in 5 years there's not a big story. I hope in 5 years transformational games are ubiquitous within classrooms. Instead of being looked at as something new, exciting, it's looked at a reliable means of effectively teaching. So we have a lot of different things going in that direction. Will tablets be ubiquitous in classrooms in 5 years? Maybe. I hope. I think that in some schools they will be. And as tablets and new technology really become more commonplace, there will be better distribution methods for games. There will be better adoption for games, and playing these activities will be just a natural way of learning, as play is a natural way of learning for small children. Everyone will be able to do this in a more intuitive way. And I know I really fought your question, and I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's not an easy question. That's the whole concept of predictions there. It is difficult. No, that's good. Emily?
I think it's so building on that idea of kind of access to technology. I see that the opportunities in the developing world are very, very much on the cusp of a turning point, and we have communities and audiences in the developing world who've essentially had no access to media ever, and now have access to mobile technologies and telecom services, and are using smartphones. And this prevalence of smartphones in areas there's been zero interaction with any kind of media before is really a huge opportunity in terms of learning and engagement and communicating with these communities. And I think it's not maybe something that we will notice as much here in the Western world, but it's a huge opportunity. So I think we're going to just see a prevalence of apps and games just going into that field because these are communities that are hungry for content.
Yeah, just to add slightly to it, I mean, I basically couldn't agree more that it's hopefully going towards a subtler usage of games where we're not really talking about it because it's just so commonplace. But just the one thing to highlight that Andy, you actually brought up beforehand was Ender's Game, which everybody is, well, hopefully a lot of people have read and possibly seen. Although I really hope that game doesn't come into sort of common usage because that's kind of scary. But it's a major component of their society, this game. And it's like how they survive, basically. And nobody questions that these kids are going and playing games. And while I really hope we're not doing that to our young children in the near future, I do think that we will kind of get to a point where nobody really sort of even thinks, oh, well, this is something brand new, or, this is something strange or out there. It'll just be that basically, yeah, that's the way it's done. People want to approach things with a fun and interactive way. That's a great way to learn. Hopefully in the future people will be asking, how did anybody not do this? I think that's what we'll get eventually.
That would be a headline.
I'm gonna piggyback off your comment a little bit, and certainly don't want to go down the road of Ender's Game, but kind of using that as a context and a framework. Is there going to be a time where a transformative game is going to win an election, or stop a war, or maybe end violence in a city? Did you see that possibility? This is a crystal ball here, guys. Anything can happen in there.
So let's take a look at this ball a little bit more. So we saw the power of connection of people a lot, and going back a little ways in the Arab Spring and Twitter's influence on that, the ease of media and the ease of communication, to the extent that games are a way of connecting people, bring people together, being able to illustrate things that are important to a common goal, reinforce humanity, and common values among people of various and disparate cultures. It can certainly be a unifying force. I think for a lot of things, and those just being different manifestations of that process of coming together. If one person thinks something's fun, other people might. You see, this universe of creativity in Minecraft coming together, and that's a community and people sharing ideas back and forth. So you get these massive games with massive interest from all different cultures. It becomes a hub of sharing ideas, culture, information. So yeah, they're super powerful, and they certainly could be used in that respect.
And with your subject matter you deal with, and also
I would also say I would argue that elections already are a game. They are a system, and anything that has a system to it can be turned into a game. And I think we all play the election game every 4 years, and it's a really fun one sometimes, and sometimes it can be really disappointing. Yeah, it's a non-winning game. But I would say, yeah, I mean the opportunities lie where there are systems, and you can incorporate the system into a game.
Okay, great. So this may be a similar question, but still looking into the crystal ball, Chris Bennett, start with you. What do you predict will be a tipping point for transformative games as a default solution in training, behavior change, community building? You painted the picture of the day when it isn't really questioned as to whether why or why not would you create a game. What's going to what's going to be the tipping point for that potentially?
Sure. I'm not sure that there'll necessarily be quite a tipping point per se, but at least a point of acceleration. At least, with my experience, working with different organizations on transformative games, it's very frequently, a single thought leader or a small pocket kind of coming up with the first solution for that organization. Sometimes it can even be the whole organization, but a lot of times it's the first. And I think that a really significant point that we may not necessarily see in the news, but that will definitely have a great effect, is going to be basically when that sort of group of thought leaders or single thought leader trying to bring a game solution into education or into professional training or whatever it may be. There's more than one of those, all doing sort of different ideas within the same sort of organization and the same structure. Because there's, of course, so many different things that can be addressed using games, as we clearly covered already. And when they then sort of realize, basically, that they're having more or less the same thought, and then that starts to become a conversation between them about how they're addressing these different problems. And basically, they're talking about the same things that we talk about within the industry, but outside of it in their organizations and in their educational structures. I think that that's going to be, even if it's not necessarily a really pointed tipping point, that's going to be sort of basically a self-catalyzing situation where it just keeps building and building on top of itself.
Okay, great. Emily?
I mean, I have a couple answers to that. I think, one is the funding. If there's funding, more funding available, we're seeing more organizations and grants and government programs putting funding towards the development of games, the implementation of games, and the evaluation of games. All three of those are kind of important in the equation. I think economies of scale, so when we have organizations coming to us, they're often looking at games as a solution because they can't deploy 100 people out into the field to do a training for every single group in different places, but they can send a game out and to 100 different people and they can all play it. So this idea of being able to scale education, scale training, scale existing models of things that aren't necessarily affordable to scale or in a sense of getting things out into the field, they're just not possible. I think the other thing is, as a tipping point, you kind of touched on this. Right now we have lots of silos. We have people working on individual games for their individual purposes, and they don't even realize that the person next door to them is working on a similar game with a similar purpose. And this idea of kind of bringing these communities together. And I think the other big thing that we kind of danced around a little earlier when we were talking about transformance as a definition, but this idea of moving away from thinking of games for education and for transformance and for learning as a bad thing. And even within the game community right now, there's kind of a rift between game developers for entertainment who see themselves as the real game developers and game developers who are designing games for impact and education, who kind of get, it's like a taboo thing. And I think we're seeing more and more tools becoming available for people to enter into the space and to be able to make games of different types. So the same way we saw, going back to my analogy of the film space from earlier, early in the film world we had musicals and westerns, right? And now we have documentaries and all sorts of different types of film genres, and nobody questions it. And I think we still need to move into a space where the game community as a whole is respecting and accepting that there's just different types of games that appeal to different people. Not everything needs to be a war game. It doesn't mean it's a bad game if it's not a war game.
And learning from each other too. I mean, because there's a lot of eclectic again elements that come into both spaces, and there can a lot that can be learned from both groups. So, yeah. Chris.
Yeah, I think just to echo a lot of the points because I think they're great is. But there's one other thing just to emphasize that nothing succeeds like success, truism, but it's true. So you need a big hit, and what do I mean by a big hit in the transformational game space is something that's widely seen as effective and cost-effective and popular, and people will want to emulate maybe not that exact thing, but the thought process that led to that thing. So, for instance, if a university is able to prove effectiveness of one means of teaching way statistically significantly above others, others will follow and try to figure out how to replicate that. And then others will try to fund that option. So big hits, big successes within the industry will lead, I think, to an inflection point where it becomes more commonplace. And you know, so I think that's something that could really help.
Great, thank you. We're going to have to end there. Our time is up. I understand there are a number of questions that have been submitted through the Twitter feed, so I'll definitely go out and take a look at those, and certainly if the panelists have time, they'll do so as well. So I want to thank all of you for attending and for your questions, and certainly thank our panelists for their insight.
Thank you.